Claire Whitmore stood in the middle of a $70 million private jet and told security to remove Andrew Bennett. The single father had just warned her that the trim wheel was turning on its own, before either pilot had touched the controls, but Claire looked at his worn technical jacket and called him a problem. Andrew stepped through the door without arguing. Less than 30 seconds later, the control yoke jerked forward, an alarm tore through the cabin, and smoke began pouring from the tail section. Claire ran down the stairs, her voice breaking apart. "Andrew, please come back. I was wrong. Please save us." 3 hours earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Andrew Bennett had driven his daughter to the small airport outside Jackson Hole while a storm crawled toward the valley from the northwest. He and 6-year-old Lily needed to reach Denver for a quiet memorial, a private hour set aside for the woman who had once been his wife and Lily's mother. It was also her birthday. Andrew had missed the memorial the year before because an emergency safety inspection had pulled him away at the last minute, and he had promised his daughter that this year would be different. Lily sat in the terminal holding an old sweater that had belonged to her mother. Andrew checked the departure board and found that the only commercial flight to Denver had already been canceled. An airline employee explained that ice was forming faster than the ground crews could clear it, and that the airport lacked enough de-icing equipment to keep the runway safe. Commercial flights would not resume until morning. Andrew did not let his disappointment show in front of his daughter. He called every rental counter he could find, checked the mountain highway conditions, and asked about smaller airports nearby. Nothing worked. The pass through the mountains could close before they made it halfway, and no rental company would risk sending a car out in front of the storm. His sister Rachel worked at the private terminal that afternoon, and she offered to keep Lily with her while Andrew searched for another way. Lily asked her father if they were still going to try. Andrew told her that he would not promise something he could not control, but that he would do everything within his power. Before Rachel led her toward the staff lounge, Lily asked one more question, one that would return to him within the hour. "What if you see something dangerous, and nobody believes you?" Andrew answered that he would still have to say it out loud. The truth did not stop being true just because nobody wanted to hear it. After Lily left, a coordinator from Whitmore Global approached him. The company had hired Andrew weeks earlier to perform an independent safety review of one of their private aircraft, and his preliminary report needed to reach the Denver office by the following morning. The jet scheduled to fly there that afternoon still had one open seat for technical personnel, and Andrew's name had already been added to the passenger manifest. Reluctantly, he agreed to fly ahead. Rachel would bring Lily to Denver on the first available commercial flight the next day, and Andrew told himself this was the fastest way to finish his work and still be ready when his daughter arrived. As he crossed the tarmac toward the aircraft, gleaming under a gray sky, Andrew heard something that did not belong. A small motor near the tail was running longer than it should have. The jet sat outside the private terminal with its main engines silent, drawing power instead from a ground cart that fed the cabin lights and climate system. Andrew slowed his pace as he neared the tail. He heard a thin electrical whine, followed by a short, uneven sound, like a small motor trying to move something that had already met resistance. The sound stopped before anyone else noticed it. He did not draw a conclusion right away. He circled the aircraft, studying the control surfaces, looking for leaks, impact marks, or any sign of unfinished maintenance. Nothing was visible from the outside. When he climbed the stairs and looked through the open cockpit door, he saw the trim wheel shift slightly on its own. No pilot had touched it. The movement lasted less than a second before it stopped. The narration here can be kept simple, because the audience needs to understand only the essentials. A tail trim system helps a pilot hold the aircraft's nose at the correct angle during takeoff and climb. If that system quietly drives itself to the wrong position, a pilot can lose the ability to raise the nose off the runway at the exact moment it matters most. Andrew asked the captain, a steady man named Daniel Brooks, whether the flight control system had recently been serviced. Daniel admitted that a position sensor near the tail had been replaced 4 days earlier. After the repair, the system had briefly thrown a warning that vanished the moment it was restarted. Andrew asked to see the maintenance log. Daniel said operations had already signed off and cleared the aircraft to fly. Andrew asked whether the full calibration procedure required after replacing that sensor had actually been completed. Daniel could not answer with certainty. All he knew was that a man named William Hale, the company's director of operations, had confirmed the aircraft was airworthy. Andrew had spent enough years around aircraft to know that a signature on a form was not the same thing as a system that had actually been proven safe. He asked Daniel who had performed the sensor swap and whether that technician had signed off on the follow-up calibrations separately from the general clearance. Daniel admitted he did not know. The paperwork he had seen only showed a single approval bundled together, covering both the repair and the return to service in one signature. To Andrew, that was itself a warning sign. A careful shop would never combine those two steps because a calibration error hidden inside a rushed bundle was exactly the kind of mistake that could sit quietly for days before revealing itself at the worst possible moment. While they spoke, the trim wheel moved again. This time Andrew heard the motor run for nearly 2 full seconds. Daniel saw it too. He ran a control check. The system responded normally, with no red warning and no error message that lingered on the screen. Daniel began to believe it was simply part of a self-test routine. Andrew disagreed. He explained that intermittent faults were often the most dangerous kind, because they could disappear during a check and return the moment the power source changed. He recommended cutting all power to the aircraft, inspecting the sensor directly, and confirming that every piece of maintenance equipment had been removed from the system. Daniel said that could take hours. Andrew told him that time pressure did not turn an unsafe aircraft into a safe one. A ground worker announced that the chief executive's motorcade had arrived. Daniel checked his watch. The jet had less than 30 minutes left before it lost its final departure slot ahead of the storm. Andrew looked toward the terminal. A line of black vehicles pulled up outside, and men in dark suits stepped out first. Then Claire Whitmore appeared, and the one person with the authority to delay the flight turned out to be the one person who could not accept delay. She was flying to Denver for a vote that would decide whether she kept meaningful control of the company her father had built. Since his death, she had learned that hesitation was read by the board as weakness, and that every soft moment she allowed herself in a meeting became a story repeated afterward about whether she was truly ready to lead. She had built her entire public presence around never appearing unsure, and that presence had carried her through 2 years of quiet challenges to her authority. It had also, without her fully realizing it, made her impatient with anything that slowed her down, including warnings she did not have time to evaluate. Claire was on her way to Denver for a vote that would decide the future of Whitmore Global. Since her father's death, a faction on the board had quietly worked to strip away her authority, arguing that she was too young, too inexperienced, and too willing to let emotion guide her decisions. William Hale had always presented himself as her most loyal ally, but he had spent months building relationships with the very shareholders trying to push her out. The vote in Denver would take place that evening. If Claire failed to arrive, William could push through an agreement that would cost her the power to veto board decisions for years. She stepped out of the car with her honey blonde hair loose over her shoulders, wearing a fitted teal dress with a deep neckline beneath a long cream coat, every inch of her presentation built for command. The staff around her tensed immediately. Claire did not raise her voice. She simply asked how many minutes remained before the airport suspended departures. William answered that they had 20 minutes to be in the air. When she boarded the aircraft, she saw Andrew sitting near the cockpit with a folder of technical documents on his lap. His gray jacket, faded and functional, looked nothing like the tailored suits filling the cabin. She assumed he was a maintenance worker who had failed to leave the aircraft, and she told an assistant to remove him. Daniel explained that Andrew was an independent safety consultant, that his name was already on the manifest, and that his report needed to be delivered in Denver. Claire was irritated that no one had asked her directly. William immediately claimed he had not known Andrew was scheduled on this flight either, distancing himself before any blame could reach him. Andrew stood and calmly introduced himself, saying he would not interfere with the schedule. Claire was prepared to let it go to save time, but then Andrew added that the engines should not be started until the tail trim system had been inspected. Claire stopped. She asked how long an inspection would take. Andrew said it would require at least cutting power and rechecking the sensor, and that he could not promise a timeline until he understood the cause. William objected at once, insisting his own maintenance team had already cleared the aircraft. Claire asked whether the cockpit had produced a formal warning. Andrew answered honestly that the fault had appeared only briefly. William smiled, turning an honest warning into an unsupported guess, and a board member seated nearby wondered aloud whether this contractor was simply trying to extend his invoice by inventing a new inspection. Andrew did not raise his voice. He asked only that they check the maintenance log and cut power for a few minutes. Claire looked at his worn jacket. She told him he was permitted to fly to deliver his report, not to give orders to her crew. Andrew answered that he was not giving an order. He was giving the kind of warning any responsible person would give. The answer landed as a challenge in front of her board, and William watched her expression carefully, aware that if Claire lost her composure now, she would end up defending the very mistake he had spent days hiding. Claire asked Daniel directly whether the aircraft could fly. Daniel hesitated. He said the standard checks had all come back normal, but that he still wanted more time. William cut in, repeating that the paperwork had already been signed. For Claire, that was enough. She told security to escort Andrew off the aircraft. No one used force. A security officer simply stepped forward and asked Andrew to gather his materials. For a moment, Claire almost reconsidered. Something in the way Andrew had spoken, calm and unhurried, without a trace of the posturing she usually saw from people trying to justify a fee, made her hesitate. But William was already moving, already directing the crew toward departure, already turning the room's attention back toward the clock. Claire told herself that leaders who stopped to question every caution would never get anywhere at all, and she let the moment pass. Andrew looked at Daniel, then at Claire. He said this was their last chance to stop before a small warning became an emergency. Claire answered coldly that the aircraft did not need his permission to fly. Andrew did not beg to stay. He collected his folder and walked toward the door. Before descending the stairs, he stopped and spoke to Daniel one final time. When you disconnect from ground power, watch the trim wheel. If it starts turning, do not try to reset the system. Cut everything. Claire ordered the door closed the moment Andrew stepped off. William urged Daniel to start the engines to protect their remaining departure slot. A ground crew member began pulling the external power card away from the aircraft. Power shifted to the internal generator. In the cockpit, the trim wheel began turning again, faster than either of the 2 times before. The instant ground power disconnected. A maintenance line that had never been properly isolated began feeding electricity directly into the trim motor. The wheel spun steadily toward a position that would drive the aircraft's nose down. Daniel hit the primary trim cutout switch on the yoke. Nothing changed. His first officer, a younger man named Eric, tried a second isolation switch. The wheel paused for less than a second, then continued turning. A red warning lit the cockpit display. An alarm filled the space. Daniel ordered the engine that had just been started shut down. Eric complied, but the trim motor kept running because it was drawing power from a backup source that bypassed the normal shutdown sequence. The control column was pulled forward with enough force that Daniel had to hold it with both hands to keep the mechanism from moving further. In the cabin, board members rose from their seats. Claire told everyone to sit down. William insisted this was only a startup glitch and suggested the crew simply reset the system. Daniel shouted that no one was to touch the power again. A smell of hot plastic drifted from the rear of the cabin. Within seconds, thin smoke began leaking from a vent near the tail. The trim motor was still trying to drive the mechanism even though it had nearly reached its limit. The rising current was heating the wiring beyond its rated capacity. If a wire ignited inside the tail structure, fire could reach other control systems before rescue crews could respond. Eric radioed the tower to request emergency vehicles. His voice tight but steady. The tower confirmed a crew was already rolling, alerted the moment the cockpit declared trouble. Outside, the ground staff who had been preparing the aircraft for departure now stood near the wingtip, unsure whether to run or wait for instruction, watching smoke rise from a jet that moments earlier had looked perfectly ordinary. Daniel called for evacuation. William argued they had not actually seen a flame. Daniel answered that by the time they saw one, it might already be too late. Claire saw genuine fear in her captain's eyes, and Andrew's warning returned to her all at once. If it starts turning, do not try to reset the system. Claire ran to the door. The stairs had not been fully retracted since the ground crew paused the moment the alarm sounded. Andrew was walking toward the terminal less than 50 yards away. Claire called his name. The wind swallowed the first attempt. She stepped down several stairs despite William's demand that she return to the cabin, and she called again. Andrew stopped and turned. He saw smoke rising from the tail, then looked up at the stairs where Claire stood. The coldness and command that had defined her only minutes earlier were gone from her face. She shouted that the system would not shut down and that the pilots did not know where the power was coming from. Andrew did not move at first. Claire had to say the words that, only minutes before, she never imagined she would say in front of her own staff and board. "I was wrong." The smoke thickened. Claire gripped the railing. "Andrew, please come back. Please save us." Andrew did not hesitate because he wanted revenge. He hesitated because he was no longer considered part of the flight. Claire had publicly removed him. If he returned and something went wrong, William could easily accuse him of trespassing on the aircraft and interfering with company property. An accusation like that could cost Andrew his license, his livelihood, and the income that supported his daughter. He looked through the terminal windows. Lily was still safely inside with Rachel, unaware of what was happening on the tarmac. Andrew remembered her question from an hour earlier. What if you see something dangerous and nobody believes you? He remembered his own answer as well. You still have to say it. The truth does not stop being true just because nobody wants to hear it. If Andrew turned away now, he could protect himself. But everything he had ever taught his daughter about responsibility would become empty words the moment he chose comfort over action. He set folder and called over a ground worker, giving him a short list of instructions. Call the airport fire crew. Clear the area behind the aircraft. Keep every vehicle away from the tail. Do not reconnect ground power. Bring insulated tools and breathing protection. Then Andrew ran back toward the jet. Claire stepped aside to let him climb the stairs. He did not thank her for calling him back. He looked directly at her and set a condition. If I go in, everyone does exactly what I say. No arguing, no waiting for a vote, no putting the company's image ahead of getting people out. Claire agreed immediately, without negotiation. William stepped forward and said Andrew had no authority to give orders on this aircraft. Claire turned to him, and this time her command was aimed in the right direction. From this moment forward, he has the highest authority on this airplane. Andrew stepped inside and gave his first order, which was not to save the jet but to abandon it. He smelled burning insulation the moment he entered the cabin, but he did not rush straight into the cockpit. His first move was ordering a full evacuation. William objected, worried about cameras and ground staff witnessing the board fleeing their own aircraft. Andrew answered that a jet could be replaced. The people inside it could not. Claire ordered everyone to follow Andrew's instructions. The flight attendant opened the main door fully and guided passengers down the stairs. Several board members tried to grab their bags. Andrew told them to leave everything behind. William still wanted to remain on board to protect what he called company assets. Claire ordered him off the aircraft directly. Only Andrew, Daniel, Eric, and one flight attendant carrying emergency oxygen equipment stayed behind for the next phase. Andrew put on breathing protection and entered the cockpit. Daniel showed him what had already been tried. Both trim cutout switches were in the off position. The main engine had been shut down. The generator was no longer running. Yet the trim wheel continued turning in short bursts. Andrew asked Eric to isolate a specific sequence of circuit breakers. Several cockpit displays went dark. The trim wheel slowed but did not stop completely. Andrew understood that the system was drawing power from a line that bypassed the normal control circuit entirely. He asked Daniel whether there were records from the most recent maintenance work. Daniel said the paperwork existed only in the operations department's electronic system. Andrew thought back to the sensor replacement. During that kind of repair, a technician sometimes uses a maintenance connector to power the trim motor directly for testing. If that connector had never been disconnected, the cockpit switches would never be able to fully isolate the system. Andrew told Daniel to hold the control column steady rather than fight it, since forcing it could damage the backup cabling further. Airport fire crews arrived. Andrew coordinated with their commander by radio and asked them to scan the rear fuselage with a thermal camera. The scan found a hot spot beneath the horizontal stabilizer, and the temperature was climbing steadily. Andrew left the aircraft and asked a ground technician named Nathan Cole to come with him. Nathan knew where the service panel was located, but he was afraid to open it without direct authorization from the manufacturer, since William had forbidden staff from touching it without written approval. Andrew explained that they were not repairing the aircraft. They were isolating the source of the fire. Claire publicly handed emergency authority to Andrew and Nathan. The two men approached the rear fuselage with insulated tools. When they opened the first panel, they found a red maintenance connector still seated in its active position. It was hot enough that the plastic housing had begun to warp. Andrew stopped Nathan from touching it directly. He gave a short list of steps. Disconnect the main battery. Disconnect the backup battery. Shut down every non-essential system. Confirm ground power was fully disconnected. Prepare a fire extinguisher rated for electrical equipment. Once the power sources were isolated, the trim wheel finally stopped turning. Smoke was still escaping, which meant the insulation had grown hot enough to smolder on its own. Andrew told the fire crew not to spray water directly onto the electrical panel. since that could cause a short circuit or push smoke deeper into the structure. The thermal camera showed the hotspot sitting behind a second layer of housing. Nathan said that panel was normally opened only inside a maintenance hangar. Andrew asked the fire commander for the current temperature reading. It was still rising. Andrew decided to open the second access panel. He did not attempt this alone. Nathan released the fasteners. The fire crew stood ready with cooling equipment. Daniel monitored the stabilizer position from the cockpit, and Eric confirmed every power source remained disconnected. When the second panel opened, they saw a section of scorched wiring and a small flame. The fire crew used an appropriate extinguishing agent, then cooled the surrounding area gradually. The temperature began to fall. Andrew still refused to declare the aircraft safe. He asked for continued monitoring since wiring could smolder inside insulation without visible flame. After several more minutes, the thermal camera confirmed the hotspot was no longer rising. Daniel reported that the stabilizer had stopped near its extreme nose-down limit. The jet was completely unable to fly. But no one remained in the cabin, and the risk of a spreading fire had been controlled. Andrew asked for a full count of every passenger and staff member. Claire confirmed no one had been left behind. Only then did Andrew remove his gloves. Claire approached, trying to find the words to thank him. Andrew did not answer right away. He only asked whether everyone aboard the aircraft was safe. Claire said they were. Andrew nodded, gathered his folder, and walked toward the terminal. He did not wait for applause. He did not wait for a public apology. He did not tell anyone about his past. He only wanted to call his sister and know that his daughter was still all right. Behind him, William studied the aircraft surrounded by fire trucks. He understood that the investigation would eventually uncover the unfinished maintenance work. Before that happened, he needed someone else to carry the blame. Andrew returned to the terminal, where Lily still sat with Rachel, unaware of the details of what had happened outside. Andrew confirmed his daughter was safe and asked Rachel not to tell her anything yet. He did not want Lily to feel frightened or to believe her father had nearly failed to come home. Aviation investigators requested information about the person who had directed the emergency response. When they checked his license and background, they discovered that Andrew had once served in a flight control testing unit within the Air Force, where he specialized in rare failures involving trim systems, backup power, and position sensors. He had personally investigated a similar case years earlier involving a trim system that continued receiving power after a pilot had used the standard cutout switch. He also held a commercial pilot's license and a certification in flight control system evaluation. Claire listened as the investigator read through his record. She realized Andrew was not an airport employee looking for attention. He was the one person at that airport with direct experience in exactly the kind of failure that had just occurred. What embarrassed her even more was that Andrew had never once used his background to demand respect. He had only spoken about the danger itself. She thought back to the exact words she had used to dismiss him. She had asked if he was the captain. She had asked if he was the manufacturer's chief engineer. Each time he answered honestly, she had treated the honest answer as proof that he did not belong in the conversation, when in truth his honesty was the very thing that should have told her to listen more closely, not less. While Claire prepared to find him, William called an emergency meeting with company lawyers and several board members. He announced that Andrew had interfered with the aircraft systems without proper authorization. William claimed the trim motor had only overheated seriously after Andrew ordered multiple circuit groups disconnected. He proposed a public statement claiming the aircraft had suffered only a minor malfunction, that Andrew had overreacted, that opening the service panel had caused further damage, and that Whitmore Global was reviewing potential legal liability against an outside contractor. Several board members agreed. They cared less about who was right and more about avoiding a fleet-wide grounding for inspection. William told Claire privately that if she defended Andrew publicly, she risked losing her seat in the very vote she had been racing to reach. This was the real test for Claire. Begging Andrew to return in a single panicked moment had been the easy part. Protecting him when it could cost her actual power would prove whether she had truly changed. Claire ordered that every maintenance log, cockpit data recording, and tarmac camera be sealed immediately. William tried to stop her. Claire told him that from that moment forward, no one in the operations department was permitted to access those files. Over the following 18 hours, investigators confirmed that the tail position sensor had been replaced 4 days earlier. The manufacturer required a full calibration procedure lasting several hours. along with a complete recheck of the control wiring before the aircraft could return to service. William had not wanted the jet grounded because of Claire's tight travel schedule, so he had approved a temporary workaround. During that procedure, the red maintenance connector had been installed to power the trim motor directly for testing. A technician had noted in an internal file that the connector had not been confirmed removed. The initial paperwork marked the aircraft as not cleared for flight. 6 hours later, that status was changed to cleared with conditions. The account responsible for the change belonged to William Hale. Cockpit data confirmed that the trim wheel had shifted on its own before Andrew was ever asked to leave the aircraft. Cabin footage showed him warning Claire, Daniel, and William directly. Tarmac footage showed that he returned only after smoke had already appeared. Nothing in the evidence suggested he had caused any damage. If anything, the thermal data proved that isolating the power source had prevented the fire from spreading further. During the board meeting that followed, William tried to defend himself, insisting he had only been protecting Claire's schedule. He reminded the room of every time Claire had said she would not accept delay, would not listen to excuses, and would replace anyone who cost the company an opportunity. Claire recognized that William had broken procedure, but she also recognized he was not entirely lying about the culture she had built. She had never directly ordered anyone to ignore a safety concern. But she had created an environment where bringing bad news to the chief executive could end a career. One older board member, a woman who had worked alongside Claire's father for many years, spoke quietly into the silence that followed. She said she had watched this same pattern happen once before, under a different name and a different piece of machinery, and that the company had simply been fortunate that time as well. She asked Claire whether she intended to keep relying on luck, or whether she intended to actually repair whatever allowed a warning to be ignored not once, but twice. Claire could have placed the entire blame on William alone. But doing that would prove she still had not truly changed. In front of the board, she admitted 3 mistakes. She had judged Andrew by his clothing and his title. She had placed her own schedule above a warning that had turned out to be correct. And she had built a culture that made employees afraid to tell her the truth. Claire suspended William, handed the sealed records to federal investigators, and ordered a full inspection of the company's entire fleet. One board member warned that this decision could still cost her the position she had spent the day fighting to keep. Claire answered that if she had to hide a real danger just to keep her chair, she did not deserve to sit in it. After the meeting, Claire found Andrew in a quiet corner of the terminal. She did not offer a vague apology. She named her mistakes plainly. She had looked at his worn jacket and assumed he did not matter. She had turned a legitimate safety warning into a fight over authority. She had ordered the one person who understood the failing system off the aircraft. Andrew listened without offering forgiveness right away. Claire offered him a large bonus and a permanent position as the company's director of aviation safety. Andrew declined the money. He said saving lives was not a debt she could settle with a check. If she truly wanted to make things right, her apology needed to protect the next person brave enough to speak up. He gave her 3 conditions instead. Every pilot, technician, and ground worker would have the authority to stop a flight the moment they identified a credible risk. No one would face retaliation for reporting a safety concern. And the safety department would operate independently from operations, reporting directly to the board rather than through any single executive. Claire agreed without hesitation, no bargaining, no delay. She chose not to fly to Denver that evening. Instead, she stayed at the airport, working with investigators, fire officials, and maintenance crews late into the night. The decision meant missing the most important vote of her career. Yet several board members who had been ready to push her aside began reconsidering, watching her take responsibility openly rather than hide behind a prepared statement. Andrew and Lily flew to Denver the next morning once commercial flights resumed. Lily appears only briefly in the closing moments of the story. She asked her father if he had warned everyone even though they had refused to believe him. Andrew told her that he had done exactly what he once promised her he would do. Lily did not ask how the aircraft had actually been saved. She simply held his hand as the two of them walked into the memorial, later than planned but together. 3 months later, Whitmore Global completed a full overhaul of its safety procedures. William faced formal accountability for altering the aircraft's maintenance status and concealing a known risk. Daniel remained the company's senior captain and became the first crew member to sign the new policy allowing any member of a flight crew to halt a departure without needing approval from above. Claire kept her position as chief executive, Not because she managed to contain the scandal, but because her transparency helped the company avoid a far larger crisis. Investors who had once questioned whether she was too young to lead now pointed to the same story as evidence of exactly the opposite. A leader willing to lose a vote rather than hide a danger, they argued, was precisely the kind of leader a company could trust with harder decisions later. Andrew accepted the safety director role on the condition that his schedule would never again cause him to miss the moments that mattered most in his daughter's life. Claire agreed without argument, and true to her word, she never once asked him to break that promise. The relationship between Andrew and Claire did not turn into romance right away. It began instead with respect. Claire learned to listen before she gave an order. Andrew came to understand that she was not permanently the cold, guarded woman he had first met, but someone brave enough to change once the truth forced her to look honestly at herself. The story ends inside the hangar that once held the damaged aircraft, now repaired and back in service. On the wall hangs a new company policy, framed where every employee can see it each morning. Anyone has the right to stop a flight the moment they discover danger. No title is ever more important than a human life.